Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh, and a very good day to all. And first of all, I would like to say thank you very much for your patience to wait for this lecture to be released, and I'm so sorry for the delay. So without further ado, let's proceed to the topics of the day, by which we're going to get to know the physiology of the respiratory system, and then we're going to deep down to serve down into the mechanics of breathing, by which how the breathing process actually occur. Alright. First, before we go deep to the content, let's take a look at the learning outcome first. So, means that at the end of this lecture, what do you should know is actually you should be able to describe the process of the breathing. Okay. And the second one, so on the second one, I hope that you can explain the pressure gradient changes which cause the air to coming in from the atmosphere into the lungs. Alright. And then we're going to take a look at the respiratory muscles. Right? How does this respiratory muscle produce the changes in the pressure as well as in the volume in our pleural cavity? Okay. And lastly, we're going to take a look at the abnormal consequences of the process. Right? So I spread an explicit outcome for you so that you can know what is hiding inside this mechanics of breathing topics. Okay, so in this topic, you should have know the changes in the lung volume, in the intrapleural pressure, in the intrapulmonary pressure. But what are these is actually in the quiet breathing. Okay, so we're going to take a look at the forced breathing as well. Don't worry. Sometimes we call it as a forced ventilations. Alright, don't worry if you don't get the term that I described right now, because as we go deep down there in the content, I believe that you will get the idea. Okay, and then we going to take a note how does the changes in the intrapleural, intrapulmonary pressure, the volume, and etc. influence on the process of inspiration as well as the expiration. Okay, so before that, what is actually the fundamental goal of respiration? So why do we breathe? So the first idea is actually, of course, to provide the oxygens to the tissue and to remove the carbon dioxide, as we know that the carbon dioxide is actually the waste product. So why do we need an oxygen? Because the oxygen is actually the main or the key ingredient that going to be used up by the cells inside our body to maintain the cellular homeostasis. Alright, to get that ATP, to get the energy to carry out the metabolic function, and etc. Alright, okay, so in general, for the process of respirations, it is occurs in two stages. Okay, we have inspiration, of course, and once we inspirate, we going to have expiration. So I believe that everyone know inspiration is the air enter into the lungs from the atmosphere, and the expiration is actually leaving the lung into the atmosphere, and the vice versa lah. Alright, so the general concept. So what is actually respiration? What does that mean by the respiration? Okay, so respiration is actually the process by which the oxygens is actually coming from the atmosphere and it's going to be delivered to the tissue, and from that tissue, from that cellular levels, this carbon dioxide from the tissue going to be removed out into the atmosphere. So meaning that if you take a look at this one, so this is actually the definition of the respiration. It must include inspiration as well as the expiration. So it is translated into the definition of the respirations. Okay, so in the process of respirations, it actually occur in 4 stages. Alright, I did write down 1, 2, 3, 4 there. So the first stage is actually the ventilation stage. So vent tu maksudnya pengudaraan lah. Alright, so the ventilation stage is actually the gaseous exchange. Look at number 1 here. The gaseous exchange that occur between the atmosphere as well as the pulmonary capillary. Alright, so occur due to the pulmonary ventilation. So we call it as the pulmonary ventilation. Alright, and the second stage is actually the transportation stage. So means that the oxygens that has been delivered into the pulmonary capillary going to be delivered from the lungs into the tissue. Okay, through the artery lah. Alright, from the heart itself, you pump the oxygenated blood to the whole system. Okay, and then we have the third stage by with the exchange state. Okay, once it has been delivered to the destination, so the gaseous exchange is going to be occur. Okay, so this process occur in the systemic blood, alright, and the tissue. And the last stage is actually the tissue stage, by which that tissue, once it's received the oxygens, the mitochondria going to take the oxygens, undergo the oxidative process, provide the energy and the pH and set, etc., cyclic cycles or whatnot. Okay, enter the Krebs cycle to produce an energy, to produce the fuels for the cells to carry out its metabolic process. So that is actually the respiration stages. Alright, so this is just a clear view on the ventilation phase, on the transportation phase, on the exchange phase, as well as the tissues phase. Okay, so I bet that you have gone through in the component of the respiratory systems in the anatomy classes. Okay, so we just have a quick recap on what is actually the structures that is provided for the respirations. Alright, so it is important for you to understand about the structure first before you deep down into the physiological process of the breathing, because that structure actually having an influence on the process. Okay, so we have the number one is the upper respiratory tract. Okay, you have the nasal cavity, you have the nostrils, larynx, and whatnot. Okay, and the second one, you will have the lower respiratory tract. Okay, and you will also have the respiratory apparatus. So what are the respiratory apparatus? So the thoracic cavity here, the skeletal, the associated skeletal muscles. You also have a smooth muscles, alright, on your bronchial that provide the bronchial tone. So all of these are associated muscles that help in the breathing process. Okay, now let's take a look at the upper respiratory tracts in quick. So we have nose, we have the paranasal sinus, pharynx, larynx, and whatnot. And why we must need this upper respiratory tract? Okay, I just want to ask you one simple questions to enlighten your thought. Okay, so have you ever asked yourself why our nose is still downward? It's not still upward. Of course, you will say, it's actually a safe structure so that when there is rain, no water going to get it into your nose. Maybe that's correct. So why your nose have a nose hair? Have you ever think about it? Alright, so you might say because you have learned it in your science class during your primary school, and you say, it's going to filter the dust and whatnot. Yes, it is correct. Have you ever asked why you must have nose? Why there is a nose structures on top of your face? So basically, there is a reasons why this nose is that shape with that kind of structures. It's kind of morphology, the appearance, and etc. So basically, it has its purpose, and the functions of the nose is the nose and the upper respiratory tract is actually to humidify and attain the body temperature, so that the air that coming into your body is actually equalized. The temperature of the air that coming into your body, into your lung, is equalized to your body temperature. Okay, so basically, right now, we have various room temperature. For example, like if let's say you are sitting in an air-conditioned room, so the temperature maybe would be 20 degrees Celsius. Alright, if let's say you like an extremely cold environment, maybe you will open your aircon to 16 degrees Celsius, for example. Or maybe that person's having marching at the outside with a 40 degrees Celsius. Alright, so the air in that environment are actually in a various temperature, so that you must have the upper respiratory tract. Therefore, this upper respiratory tract going to humidify the air to humidify the air, so that the air are equalized with your body temperature before it reach to your trachea as well as your lungs. Okay. Sorry, I got mouth ulcer. Okay, so now let's move on to the lower respiratory tract. So the component of the lower respiratory tract going to be the airway trees, the bronchial tone, the branching of airway conducting zone, and as well as the respiratory zone. And you will also have the lungs itself. Alright, in the lungs, you have the pleura, you have lobes of lungs, and you have the bronchopulmonary segment. Okay, so now let's move on to the bronchial tone. So what is bronchial tone? Okay, look at the structures of the bronchi. So there is actually a smooth muscles surrounding of your bronchi. Alright, so we do know that the bronchi is actually like a pipe that conduct the air from the atmosphere to your lungs. Alright, but in a way for your bronchi to effectively deliver the air into your lungs, they must have a certain shape and a certain size or a certain diameter. If let's say you have a large demand for the oxygen supply, so this bronchial going to be dilated, so that the air move in and out will be greater. Alright, in a normal situations, so the bronchi will be in a normal shape, but when you need or when there is high demand of the oxygens, so the bronchi going to be vasodilated. Alright, so these situations, I'll give you one situations that apply to this condition is actually during fight and flight response or during the sympathetic response. Okay, please recall back the lecture on the autonomic nervous system. I did mention to you when your sympathetic activity has been activated, it means that you are in a fight or flight response. So during that time, your body, your heart rate and everything are getting fast. So why your heart rate and everything are getting fast? Because you are in nervous situations, you are frightened and whatnot. And during that time, you need extra amount of the oxygens. That's why during sympathetic activity or activations of the sympathetic or during the sympathetic stimulation, the bronchial tone going to be dilated. Alright, it's going to be dilated. Thus, it's allow a large amount of the air to be in and out of your lungs. Alright. Okay, and then that's why this bronchial tone are actually going to be influenced by neural, chemicals and hormone, for example like inflammatory mediators, cytokines, adenosine, substance P, histamines and also the VIP. Okay, so this is another example, inflammatory mediators. Alright, so for example like a person who having an asthma attack, okay, so usually if you take a look at this kids who have an asthma attack or your friends who have an asthma attack, they tend to be hyperventilated, and when they go to the clinics, they will get the nap. Alright, so what does this nap doing? This nap is actually going to relax the bronchioles, so that when it is relaxed, it will allow a large more oxygens to be coming into their lungs. Okay. Alright, so bronchodilation is actually occurs during sympathetic stimulations, and bronchoconstrictions occur during the vagal stimulation. So now let's take a look at the branching of the airways. Right, so actually in our airways, there has been branches into 23 times, or we call it as the 23 generations. Alright, so if you take a look at this structure in a blue one, you will see that we have the conducting zone, and then we will have the respiratory zone. Looking at the term itself, I bet that you understand when we talk about the conducting zone means that the regions that conducts the air into the lungs, and the respiratory zone is basically going to tell you that this is the regions that undergo gaseous exchange. Alright, so what we can say, the alveoli are actually budding of the bronchioles at these 17 generations, and there are two types of epithelial cells available in the alveoli, which is type 1 as well as the type 2. Type 1 consisting around 95%, and another 5% is actually type 2, having roles in the secretes the surfactants and assist in the alveolar repair. So we're going to take a look at the functions of the surfactants later. Okay, so what does these surfactants do in the lungs? Now let's move on to the lung structures, lungs and pleura. Alright, so lungs are actually covered by pleura. We have two layers of the pleura, which is the parietal pleura as well as the visceral pleura. I bet that you have learned this in anatomy. So we just look at this purple balloon. So basically this pleura is the enclosed space, okay, enclosed space by which the lung is placed inside it. Alright, so this pleura is actually very, very important as it contributes in the process of the breathing. We're going to take a look at it later. So how does the pleura influence in the respiration process, right? So just have a quick recap that we have the visceral pleura, means that the regions or the regions by which is close to the lung structures, and we also have the parietal pleura, which is located at the peripheral or periphery lah. Peri tu maksudnya jauh lah. So sebab tu nama dia parietal pleura. And another one is the visceral pleura. Okay, so but on top of it, on top of the visceral pleura and parietal pleura, we have a space in between which filled with the fluids inside here. We call it as the intrapleural space, or sometimes they call it as the pleural cavity. So this pleural cavity is very, very important because what do we call the parietal pleura? There is a cells there that produce a fluid, so that when the lungs is undergo its functions, inflating and deflating, so it will cause a frictions inside the friction between the visceral and parietal pleura. So this fluid inside the parietal pleura, inside the intrapleural space, are actually going to reduce the friction. Okay. Alright, so here is a quick recap on the functions of the respiratory system, by which the first function is for respiratory itself, and the second function is non-respiratory. Okay, so now let's take a look at the function of the respiratory system, by which it acts as a left ventricular reservoir. So what does that mean by left ventricular reservoir? Okay, you have learned the cardiovascular system, right? So you do know that the left ventricles in here, okay, the left ventricles are actually the regions that going to pump the blood into the systemic circulations, to the aorta, and go to the systemic circulation. So where does the blood from the left ventricles coming from? It is actually coming from the pulmonary vein, oxygenated blood, jangan confuse, ingat balik. So pulmonary vein carry the oxygenated blood into the left ventricles. But bear in mind that if let's say the person's having hemorrhage and whatnot, the blood that is going back into the left ventricles going to be reduced. But due to that, our body have their own backup process by which the lung itself will serve as the blood reservoir. Okay, because the lung itself, they have a very large amount of mesh. Okay, they have a lot pulmonary capillary, and they are actually quite compliant, so they will store around 10% of the total blood in the body system. So our blood, saya cakap 10%, right? So our body system are actually having 5 liters of blood, yeah, plus minus 5 liters of blood. If let's say I mentioned that it is 10% of 5 liters, so means that 500 mils of the blood are actually in the lungs, right? So if let's say the person is having a severe bleeding, severe hemorrhage and whatnot, so the blood going to be pumped to the whole system going to be reduced. So lungs will help pump its blood into the left ventricles, so that you have a large or enough amount of the cardiac output to be delivered into the whole system. Okay. Alright, the second one is actually to filter the small emboli from the blood. Okay, so the blood, once it's coming into the systemic circulation from the superior, inferior, vena cava and whatnot, it's going to be back into the right ventricles, and then once in the right ventricles, they're going to be pumped through the pulmonary artery into the lungs. Alright, sometimes the blood that coming back from the systemic circulations, there is a clot in it. Alright, so in order to prevent this clot going to be pumped back into the heart, and then going to cause a blockage somewhere in the arteries that supply the heart, so the lungs play its role to filter, to become a strainer by which it will filter the clot, and there also is an enzyme that going to dissolve the emboli before the blood has been returned back into the left ventricles. So they are actually playing like a safe system or a guard system that is filter the clot, so that it will not damage the other blood supply. Okay, the next is the biochemical functions by which many chemical substances are going to be removed by the lungs. For example, like prostaglandin, leukotriene, serotonin, bradykinin, and all of it are going to be filtered or going to be get rid by the lungs, right? And then the lungs also will process the inhaled air right? As well, they also play roles in the endocrine functions. So I bet that you remember that we have the angiotensin converting enzyme, ACE enzyme. So these enzymes are actually play roles in the controlling the blood pressure in our system. So where does this angiotensin converting enzyme coming from or available? It is available in the lungs, right? And as well, it will synthesize the prostaglandin and the histamine. Okay, so now let's move on to the mechanics of breathing. So we get to know the structures of the lungs, so we get to know the functions of the lungs, the physiological functions of the lungs, and it is solely for respirations or another non-respiratory functions of the lungs. And now we're going to serve down into the mechanics of breathing. Okay, the main topic, the mechanic of breathing. So what is the mechanics of breathing? Okay, so its general concept is actually to study the properties of the lung, the physical properties of the lungs, so the airways, the chest wall, and how does these structures actually involve in the respiration. So I did mention in the prelude of this topic. So I'm going to talk about how does the structures of the lung contributes to its process of the respiration. Okay, so usually, okay, during normal breathing, we call it as the quiet breathing. Okay, contohnya, saya tengah bernafas sekarang, like I'm is breathing right now during delivering a lecture. I did not push, or I did not get an extra effort to breathe in and breathe out. So this is what we call as a quiet breathing. Or maybe an example like you are right now listening to my lecture, okay, while you are lying on your bed or whatnot, okay. So this is actually, or sitting on a chair, okay. So this is actually a quiet breathing. So usually in the quiet breathing, the inspiration is actually the active process, okay, that is due to the contractions of a certain muscles, okay. So basically the inspiratory muscles, and the expiration is actually a passive process. So means that that is only active during inhalation. Meanwhile, the exhalation is actually going to occur by itself automatically due to the elastic recoils of the muscle that has been used during the inspiration. Okay, so when there is a contractions of the inspiratory muscles, you will expand your thoracic cavity, then the air will get in. Okay, we're going to take a look at it later. Okay, so this is actually what the mechanics of breathing. We inhale air. Okay, so this is actually the active process by which you will have the diaphragm, you will have the rib cage, they will expand, the diaphragm going to be contract and become flattened, right? And then they will increase the volumes of the thoracic cavity, then the air inhale going to be in. Okay, I hope that you still remember the topic. I give a simulations on how does the balloons in the store has been blowing up, right? Remember kita ada kedai yang tube balloon yang dalam tadi macam-macam untuk gift tu kan. So that balloon is actually sucks the air from the outside using a passive suction. So similar process occur to the heart that I mentioned to you previously in the cardiovascular system, by which the fluid or the blood that return back into the ventricles are actually via passive filling. Similarly to the lungs, during inhalations, when the chest is expand, the air going to be sucked into the automatically going to be sucked into the thoracic cavity or into the lungs. Alright, so the exhalation process is actually just an elastic recoil of the previous muscles. Okay, so lungs actually located in thoracic cavity, separated by the diaphragm. Okay, you have the separated by the abdomen, separated from the abdomen by the diaphragm. Okay, so in a normal situations or in a relaxed situations, our diaphragm is actually in a dome shape. Okay, so means that the thoracic cavity is not that large lah, it's not that high in volume. But during the inhalation, okay, the diaphragm start to be contracted and the external intercostal muscles start to be contracted as well. We have two muscles, okay, we call it as the inspiratory muscles. So then it will expand the chest. Once it expands the chest, the volume will be increased, thus the air will enter into the lungs. Alright, so actually when our lung is expand during inspiration process due to the contractions of the inspiratory muscles, the pressure inside the lungs is actually going to be negative in pressure. Alright? So basically, you have the atmosphere and you have the lungs. The pressure in the atmosphere is actually similar to the pressure in the lungs because the lung and the atmosphere are actually not an enclosed environment. So dia terbuka. Okay, bila dia terbuka maksudnya pressure dekat luar dan pressure dekat dalam adalah sama. But then when there is a contractions of the inspiratory muscles, apa inspiratory muscles? You have a diaphragm, and the second one you will have the external intercostal muscles. It will expand the thoracic cavity, thus reduce the pressure inside it. So when this pressure is low, the outside pressure is high, so the air from the outside going to be pushed inside the lungs. Okay, so that's how the air is move in and out of the system. You bukannya sedut, tarik nafas macam tu, you sedut you punya air masuk ke dalam, tak. Okay, cara kita bernafas during quiet breathing is actually the air tu is going in and out from your lungs is due to the expansions of the thoracic cavity. Okay. Alright, so this is the inspiratory muscles, muscles of inspiration. So we have the principal muscles as well as the accessory muscles. So during quiet breathing, basically we only use the principal muscles. So what are they? They are external intercostal muscles. Okay, you have interchondral, part of the internal intercostal muscles, and you have the diaphragm. Tak nampak sangat lah ini Yang ini adalah diaphragm dia. Nampaklah bukan ni, yang red line ni dia punya diaphragm. Okay, so a second one for the inspiratory muscles, we have the sternocleidomastoid. Okay, dekat you punya leher sini, you have a scalene anterior medial posterior, and by which these accessory muscles are actually going to be used during active or forced breathing. Okay, saya bagi awak situasi contohnya okay, kita tengah pergi nak exercise, and then instructor tu cakap, okay, kita tarik nafas, you pun tariklah nafas dengan you melapangkan dada dengan tangan you, betul tak? Pun gerakkan tangan you sampailah ke atas, kan? Kenapa you buat macam tu? Bila you deep breathing, tarik nafas dalam-dalam, dia cakap kan, deep breathing. So during that breathing, when you pull up your hand, you are actually pull this sternocleidomastoid outward, by which you going to expand your thoracic cavity. Maksudnya kita nak create lagi negatif lagi dekat dalam tu, so that you can inhale a large amount of air from the atmosphere into your lungs. Alright, and then orang tu cakap, okay, hembus nafas, you pun you turunkan tangan dan you bongkokkan badan you. Alright, betul kan macam tu? So this is actually a process that help the air to coming in, to get in into a large amount and to being exhaled in a large amount of the air outside. Okay, so that is what we call as the forced inspiration. Sekarang ni kita tak ada forced inspiration, quiet inspiration. But kalau you buat tarik nafas yang macam tu, you lepaskan kuat-kuat, you pakai you punya abdominal muscle semua, itu adalah forced inspiration and expiration. Okay, so now let's get into details on the structures of the diaphragm. They are actually supplied by the phrenic nerve C3 to C5. Okay, dome shape. Alright, not much to know about it because you already know about it. And then we have the external intercostal muscles, by which these external intercostal muscles are located in between the ribs. Right? So when they contract, they will pull the rib upward. Dia akan angkat rib tu naik ke atas. Okay. Sebab tu kalau awak tarik nafas, awak akan rasa dada awak tu naik dan turun. Okay. So you will see that look at the lateral dimension, you will see that during full expiration, and your ribs will be expand a little bit more, and the sternum will be full push forward. Okay, so this movement during inspiration, we call it as the pump and handle and also bucket handle motion. Alright, so in the anterior posterior, maksudnya ke depan dan ke belakang, you will see as a pump and handle, by which during relaxations the handle is down, but during the inspirations you are actually like pulling up the pump handle. Okay, so sternum tu pun akan bergerak ke depan lah, sama macam pump and handle. Right, but similarly, what happened to your rib cage? The rib cage dia sama macam motions of bucket and handle juga. Kalau tak, dia dekat bawah, and then bila you expand, dia akan move forward. Okay. So this is the accessory inspiratory muscles I did mention to you earlier. Okay, it's actually to use for the forced inspiration and forced expiration. Okay. So in the expiratory muscles, what do we have? Basically, please bear in mind, please remember and keep that into your mind that there is no muscles are involved in the expiratory, quiet expiratory expiration. Okay, quiet respiratory expiration. No muscles are get involved in this process because the expiratory process during quiet breathing occur due to the elastic recoil. Okay, so when does this expiratory muscles going to be used? It going to be used during active or forced expiration. Contoh yang tadi kita tarik nafas tu, you pakai accessory muscle tu semua. But then bila you hembus nafas, you hembus semua tu, itu barulah you pakai expiratory muscles. Okay. So you have the in the expiratory muscles during the forced or active expirations, you will have the abdominal muscles, okay, and you will have the internal intercostal muscles. Ingat internal intercostal untuk expiration. Okay, in the upper airways, you will have the upper airway muscles in the pharynx and as well in the larynx. Alright, so the pharynx and larynx muscles start to contract as well to ensure that it is reduced in the resistance. Okay, so the laryngeal muscles, the muscles of the nose and mouth breathing are actually going to dilate the airways so that all the air can be fully get out from the lungs. Okay, so this is the structures of the inspiration and expirations. If you can see that the chest wall and the lungs are expand, and this one is start to be reduced in the structures or in the volume lah during expirations. When it reduce in the volume, the pressure in it is high, and then it going to push the air out of the lung. Okay, so this is just a summary for the muscle of inspiration and muscle of expiration. So remember, muscle of expirations are only be used during active breathing. Okay, so we done about how the movement of the structures, how does the contractions of the muscles on the anatomical structures affect in the respiratory process. Right now, we're going to take a look at another factors that influence the respiration is actually the pressure. So as I mentioned to you earlier, okay, we have a various pressure, various pause. As I mentioned to you earlier, okay, we done talk about the respiratory. We done talk about the structures, anatomical structures of the lungs. So how does the changes in the structures, changes in the shape of your structures in the lungs influence the air to move in and out? And right now, there is another factors that influence the respiration, by which it is a pressure. Okay, so we have various type of pressure in here, okay, in the respiration process. So number one, we take a look at the outside environment first. In the outside environment, we have the atmospheric pressure. So basically, our atmospheric pressure is actually 760 millimeter of mercury, okay. And then deep down inside the pulmonary, you have the intrapulmonary pressure. And basically, during a normal situations or normal state, okay, you tak tarik nafas ke, tak hembus nafas ke, the intrapulmonary pressure are actually similar to the atmospheric pressure. So why it is similar? Sebab dia adalah bukannya ruang yang vacuum. So dia ruang yang terbuka, okay, an open area, open environment. Okay, dia macam connected to the outside environment. That's why its pressure is similar. Okay, but now let's take a look at another pressure that we have is actually the intrapleural pressure. Remember that I show you a balloon with a fist on top of it just now, the fist that press on top of the balloon. So this pleural cavity are actually the enclosed area, and it also have its own pressure. Basically, the intrapleural pressure is 756 millimeter of mercury. So if you take a look at the intrapleural pressure, 756, and the intrapulmonary pressure, 760, so there is a minus 4 millimeter of mercury difference between these two regions. Is it important to have that minus 4 millimeter of mercury difference? Yes, it is very, very important, because the minus pressure are actually have influence on the expansions of the lungs. Okay, kalau lah let's imagine if let's say you have the intrapleural pressure very high compared to the intrapulmonary pressure. Contohlah kita bagi 770. Okay, ini 760. So pressure dekat sini, if let's say the intrapleural pressure is high, it going to push the lung. So dia akan tolak lungs ni. Is it easy for the lung to expand kalau pressure kat sini besar? Kalau dia nak exhale boleh lah. Kalau nak inhale susah tak? So it going to be difficult for the lung to be expand, and then later it going to be difficult for the air to coming in from the atmosphere into the intrapulmonary. That's why the negative intrapleural pressure is comparing to the intrapulmonary pressure is very crucial, is very important, because it helps in the movement of the air from the atmosphere into the lungs, into the pulmonary. Okay, so other than that, you will have the transmural pressure, means that the pressure difference between the mural lah. Okay, nanti kita tengok. Okay, so now let's move on to the intrapleural pressure first. So as I mentioned kat sini intrapleural pressure. Alright, so you have how you calculate the intrapleural pressure. You get the 756, the pressure in the intrapleural pressure, you minus with the intrapulmonary pressure, then you will get the intrapleural pressure. Right, so its pressure is minus 4 degree. Okay, so the question is, okay, the next question is, how does the intrapleural pressure is being created and why it is negative? Okay, I did answer why it is negative, because the first is going to assist the breathing process. Alright, and the second questions, why it is and how it is negative. Okay, macam mana dia boleh jadi negatif? Okay, sekarang kita nak tengok. Alright, so this is just the raw idea why the intrapleural pressure need to be a negative. Another factor, the first factor just now is because of the pressure. So when it is too high in pressure, it cause difficulty for the lung to expand. And the second one, why the intrapleural pressure must be negative, because of the characteristics of the alveoli itself. Right, so let's imagine this is the blue one is actually the alveoli. Okay, the alveoli sac. Okay, inside of the alveoli, we know that there is an air, there will be a water droplet. Okay, so our alveoli are actually being lined by a water molecules. Right, so water molecules we have H2O kan. So H2O, kalau kita tengok chemistry, okay, dalam yalah chemistry, so water to water ni dia ada interaction sesama sendiri. Dia macam nak bergabung. Kalau you letak dua dot air, macam you buat eksperimen sendiri, you ada 2 dot air, you letak sebelah-sebelah, you letak dekat-dekat, dia akan bercantum. Betul tak? So samalah konsep dia dekat air yang duduk di dalam alveoli. Okay, so these water molecules are actually tend to attract to each other, and it will cause the lungs to collapse. Kalau lungs to collapse, susah tak dia nak besar? So dia susah. Okay, so that's why the intrapleural pressure must be negative. And other than that, it's not only the intrapleural pressure that helps the alveoli to expand. Our lungs, type 2 cells, type 2 epithelial cells in the lungs, they actually have a mechanism that going to overcome the water molecules interaction, by which they will release a surfactant. So surfactant ni buat apa? Surfactant ni dia nak prevent lah water to water interaction, so that lungs ni susah nak collapse. So dia senang nak expand. Alright, so for lungs to expand, it must overcome this factor, which is the surface tension of the alveoli. So ni lah kita panggil surface tension tadi, dia asyik nak collapse je. And you have the elastic fiber by which the lungs dia akan easily get recoiled. Alright, so the negative intrapleural pressure will help the lungs to be expand and easy for the air to coming in. Kalau tak susah. Okay, I give you another example lah. Macam kita ada belon kan, dia tahu belon parti yang liat, yang keras, yang susah nak tiup tu, macam tu lah keadaan dia. Kalau dia dah terlalu kecil macam tu, you susah nak tiup. Once dia dah kembang, dah besar sikit, you senang nak tiup. Samalah karakteristik dia dengan lungs. Okay, so tadi saya kata the intrapleural pressure is actually negative in comparing to the intrapulmonary pressure. So how does this negative being created? Okay, so how does this intrapleural pressure get negative in pressure comparing to the intrapulmonary pressure? Okay, so basically, okay, our intrapleurals ni, okay, so now we're going to take a look at how does this negative intrapleural pressure being developed. Okay. Basically, in the pleural pressure, we have the pleural fluid, and at the peripheral regions area here, there is actually a lymphatic drainage. So when you have a fluid inside here, this fluid, the excessive fluid will be drained into the lymphatic drainage, so it will lift the pulmonary intrapleural pressure will be in negative states. Okay. Okay, here is conditions that modify the intrapleural pressure. So I give you one situations like pneumothorax. Okay, so pneumothorax is actually a conditions by which the pleural pressure is leak ataupun bocor. Okay, contoh macam there is a story by which a person is going for sailing, and then swordfish tu dia macam terbang-terbang kan, dia lompat-lompat tu, and then this swordfish cocok dia punya lungs, dan orang tu memang akan having difficulty in breathing because the pleural space is actually leak, and the gas inside here will no longer be negative in pressure. So when it is no longer negative in the pressure, and some more the pressure outside is compressing or pass through the intrapleural pressure, it push the alveoli to be deflated. So bila dia dah push alveoli to be deflated, you have the ventilation, but the lungs, the alveoli will be very very hard to be inflated because high pressure in the intrapleural cavity. That's why that person having difficulty of breathing. Okay, dia bukan sebab dia tak ada darah, dia sebabkan dia tak cukup darah ke apa, disebabkan oleh tak cukup oksigen. Okay, a second one, we're going to take a look at the intrapulmonary pressure. Okay, so I did mention earlier, intrapulmonary pressure is actually similar to the atmospheric pressure. But the intrapulmonary pressure, even though it is similar to the atmospheric pressure, it can be reduced and it can be increases depending on the lung state. Okay, so let's give one examples during inspirations. So when you inhale, okay, during the inhalation process, the diaphragm going to be moved down, and the external intercostal muscles going to pull the rib upwards, and later the consequences of the pulling down of the diaphragm and pulling up of the external intercostal muscles, it will expand the thoracic cavity. So when this thoracic cavity being expanded, it will increase the intrapulmonary volume. Okay, when the volume is increased, the pressure is decreased. So that is the situation by which the intrapulmonary pressure is reduced. So when the pressure here is low and the atmospheric pressure is high, it going to cause the movement of the air from the atmospheric pressure into the intrapulmonary pressure. Alright, so when the pressure is high, the intrapulmonary pressure is high, is when the exhalation process. So during the exhalation process, when the diaphragm start to relax back, it will push upwards, and the thoracic cage will be pulling downwards, and it will push and press the lungs. Therefore, the volume inside here going to be reduced, when the volume is reduced, the pressure is high. So the high pressure going to be pushed out into the atmosphere. Okay. So basically, okay, look at this point. In normal and quiet breathing, it will decrease and increase up to plus minus or plus 1 or minus 1. Okay. But in the forced expirations or during active breathing, the expansion and expansion going to be plus minus 20, depending on the situation. Okay. So another type of pressure that we have is the transpulmonary pressure. So macam mana nak dapat transpulmonary pressure ni? You minus lah intrapulmonary, you minus intrapleural, you akan dapat trans pressure. Okay, so transpulmonary pressure ni is actually going to tell you the pressure that prevent the lungs from the collapse. Right. So here is examples on the intrapulmonary pressure. Biasanya kita ada kosong lah. Bila you inhale or exhale, intrapulmonary pressure akan jadi minus 1 and positive 1 during exhalation. Okay, during inspiration dia kena jadi minus lah. Bila dia minus, barulah udara dari luar akan masuk. Bila expirate, barulah akan keluar. Alright, so we have another one. This one is the intrapleural pressure. So intrapleural pressure basically started at minus 4. Okay, dia memang minus 4 kan tadi saya cakap. So bila you inhale, dia lagi minus lah, minus 5 and etc. Okay, so this is just the summary on the pressure changes during the quiet breathing. Okay, so here is actually the sequences, summary on the sequences of event during inspiration. So first, it must start with the contractions of the inspiratory muscles, by which the diaphragm as well as the external intercostal muscles, by which the moving down of the diaphragm and moving up of the thoracic cage, it will increase in the cavity of the thoracic. Okay, the volume of the thoracic cavity going to be increased, and when the volume increased, the pressure, the intrapulmonary pressure going to be reduced. Right, so the reduce in the intrapulmonary pressure, it will cause the air from the atmosphere to be pumped into the pulmonary. Alright, so the intrapulmonary pressure basically drop lah to minus 1 millimeter of mercury. Right, and then the air will be moving up. If you take a look at the lateral dimension, you will see the expansions of the regions of the thoracic cage or thoracic cavity. Alright, so during the exhalation process, so the inspiratory muscles, there are no contractions of the expiratory muscles, but there is only relaxations of the muscles and the recoil of the inspiratory muscle just now. Thus, it will reduce the volume of the thoracic cavity. When it reduces, the pressure going to be high, and the high pressure going to push the air inside the alveoli to the outside or to the external environment. Okay, so that's how the expiratory process take place. Alright, I think that marks the end of my lecture today. So what I can say, the secrets of life is actually right under your nose. So kita bernafas tu lah actually is the key of our life lah. So kalau kita ada oksigen tapi kita tak boleh bernafas pun, kita tak boleh nak ambil oksigen tu bagi kepada tubuh badan kita. Alright, I think that marks the end of my lecture today. And if let's say you have anything to be asked, so please feel free to ask me. And come back again to another chapter. Alright, thank you. Assalamualaikum.